Hello. In this installment, we are going to talk about triangles. Now, here's where we get important stuff. You need to not only know the definitions, but you also need to know the properties that go along with each type of triangle. All right? So, first, what is a triangle? A triangle is a polygon with three sides. Okay? So we have all these different types of triangles that we have in the pictures here, and those are different ways that we can draw triangles. The first property that we're going to talk about for triangles is that the sum of the measures of all the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. So if I take each of the angles, doesn't matter what kind of triangle I have, and I sum up all those angles, that measure of all those angles equals 180 degrees. The next thing we need to know is that the median is the line segment that connects the vertex to the midpoint of the opposite side. So if I take any angle and I draw a line segment from a vertex to the opposite side and connect it to its midpoint, that is the median. Okay? Next is an angle bisector. An angle bisector is a line segment that bisects an angle of a triangle. An angle bisector is a line segment that bisects any angle. Right now we're just talking about triangles, but it's actually any angle. So that's an angle bisector. A perpendicular bisector is a line that goes through the midpoint of a side and is perpendicular to it. So if I have any side and I go to the midpoint and I draw a perpendicular line, that is the perpendicular bisector. Okay? Doesn't have to go through the vertex, it just has to be perpendicular at the midpoint. Then it's a perpendicular bisector. Whereas if I have a perpendicular line segment that connects a vertex to the line of the opposite side, that's called the altitude or the height. Those two words are interchangeable. So if I have a perpendicular line that goes to the vertex and the opposite side, that's the altitude. So if I have a vertex to the opposite side, that's the altitude. Now, notice that in that triangle, the altitude is on the inside. But if I have an obtuse triangle, we'll talk about obtuse in a minute, that I can draw the altitude outside of the triangle. Okay? That's important. Equilateral triangles are triangles that have all sides congruent. To denote congruency, I typically put a little tick mark going across the side. If all my sides are congruent, that also tells me that all my angles are congruent. If I have an angle bisector in an equilateral triangle, then that also tells me that that angle bisector connects to is also a perpendicular bisector. Okay, so that tells me that it goes from the vertex down to the midpoint of the other side. Okay, it's a very important line segment in an equilateral triangle. Okay, next we're going to talk about isosceles triangles. Isosceles triangles are triangles with at least two congruent sides. Okay, the properties here are that they have two angles congruent, and those are they're not typical, they are the angles opposite those two sides. Okay, the angles opposite the two congruent sides are congruent. The angle bisector of the angle formed is the perpendicular bisector. So notice that, so this angle right here, this line right here, these angles are now congruent. That's an angle bisector. Okay? Not only is this the altitude, it's an angle bisector, so this piece right here is congruent to this piece right here. And this is the midpoint. So this point right here is the midpoint in an isosceles triangle. Okay, so that's going to be very important when we get throughout this. Right triangles are a triangle with one right angle. An acute triangle is a triangle with all acute angles. Now, notice that if I have an equilateral triangle, that all my angles are 60 degrees, which means that an equilateral triangle is also an acute triangle. Okay? Those are 3 acute triangles. An obtuse triangle is a triangle with one obtuse angle. That means that it has one angle between 90 and 180 degrees. Okay? A scalene triangle is a triangle with no sides congruent. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.